Hi everyone, for those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Darren. I'm a recent Year 12 graduate from Scotch College based in Melbourne, Australia, and starting in March of this year, I will be studying medicine at Monash University. So for today's video, I wanted to talk about the GAT, or the General Achievement Test. This is a test that all VCE 3-4 students sit around June of each year, but for us, because of the coronavirus, it was actually delayed to about October. So you guys have probably heard of the GAT through things like the GAT phrase or the GAT memes. The GAT memes are really relatable after you've sat through the entire exam, and they're actually quite funny as well. So why would I want to talk about the GAT? It's kind of like the butt of a lot of jokes, and a lot of people just go in there and wing it and sort of just go there for meme content rather than actually taking it as another sort of VCAR test. So there are two main reasons why I actually want to talk about the GAT. So the first main reason is what happened this year with the coronavirus. You never really know what happens, and throughout the year we were really told by our teachers that the General Achievement Test would be much more important than usual to derive our scores, because it's sort of a consensus that the GAT reflects an innate ability rather than sort of our studying skills. So for example, if someone was heavily impacted by coronavirus and they didn't do that well in their exams, but they did well in the GAT, it shows that they have the natural ability to do well, but they didn't because of the pandemic, so their score may have been scaled up. And I think that was a sentiment that was echoed around other schools as well. From what I heard, a lot of people put much more effort into the GAT this year than they usually do. So the second reason is how the GAT is used normally. So there are two main ways I think the GAT's used. One is to slightly scale and to match your study scores, because the VCAR assessors and the people working there will sort of compare your study scores with your GAT scores and moderate them to see if they match. If anything's suspicious, one's much higher than the other. Sometimes they may check as well. How much exactly the GAT affects your ultimate study score and your ATAR, no one really knows. I don't think VCAR divulges that, but I think it's better to assume that it's worth more than it actually is, rather than to underestimate the GAT. And the sort of second part of this second reason is the main use of the GAT. And this is the one that I knew quite well before year 11 and 12. I didn't really know about the other ones. And that is, if you're absent for an exam, the GAT plays a big part in deriving your score. Now, for me, and I think for anyone basically, you don't know that you'll be at every exam you don't know 100% that you'll be at every exam. Because you really can't predict your own health, the health of your family, or other accidents that may occur. So I think it's really good to put in solid work for the GAT, or at least put in your best effort, so that you have that reassurance that if anything does happen, you do have the GAT to back you up. So this video will sort of be in two sections. One, I will give a really quick overview of the sections of the GAT, and secondly, I'll just go straight into some tips for each section. I scored quite well in the GAT this year, including scaling. It was a 48 for written communications, 50 for maths and science, and 50 for humanities and arts. And this was much better than what I did in year 11. Year 11, I think I was low 40s for a lot of them. I think I was low 40s for all three. And so it's quite a big improvement. And I also did put in slightly more effort this year than I did for last year. So please enjoy the video. So a general overview of the GAT. If you want to see some past exams for yourself, just search up VCAA space GAT and you can find them all there. So there's always two writing tasks at the start of the GAT. The first writing task is more informative, gives you a lot of pictures, a lot of statements, sometimes tables and graphs, and they're based around one theme, such as Mars. And the task asks you to present the information as best you can, to just present it, no sort of your own point of view or arguments like that. With the second writing task, it does want you to present your argument a bit more. It gives a couple philosophical statements. For example, new ideas are often distrusted until they work, and it encourages you to use one or more of the statements to present your own stance on a certain topic or an issue. So VCAR, on the GAT, it says they recommend 30 minutes for the first writing task and 30 minutes for the second writing task, and 2 hours for the entire multiple choice. The multiple choice is a mixture of questions. They include sort of English comprehension questions, maths questions, sometimes involving multiplication, division, and there's also some puzzles and more sort of like Venn diagram kind of logic questions as well. So before I dive into each section of the GAT, I'd like to give some advice about the GAT as a whole. For me, I didn't actually follow the timing advice by VCAR, nor the order to do the sections in. So I actually did multiple choice first, and then I went to the 2 writing tasks. Main reason for this is because I really wanted more time to complete my writing, especially because that was my most surprisingly bad section on last year's GAT. So there were 70 multiple choice questions in the bulk of the exam, and I felt like 2 hours was more time than I needed. I aimed for a minute per question, and I ended up hitting that. So I finished the multiple choice in 1 hour and 10 minutes rather than the recommended 2 hours. And so for the writing task, I had 1 hour and 50 minutes to do both rather than 1 hour. And I knew I particularly wanted more time with the philosophical, the second writing task, because I wanted to be able to think of an original, or at least a good point of view that I could back up and that I could talk about in depth. So I ended up spending 50 minutes on the first writing task and then an hour on the second writing task. So that was how I spent my remaining 1 hour 50 minutes. It wasn't exactly precisely those times, so I had about 5 minutes to spare at the end. I just read over my writing tasks and looked over some multiple choice questions that I had a bit of trouble with earlier on. So for actually preparing for the GAT, Scotch was really good. We had work solutions and videos of teachers working through the questions, so I could see the way the GAT kind of wanted me to think. With past exams, what I did was I did the 2018 exam. I didn't do the 2019 one because I actually sat it, so it wouldn't have helped much. And the way I did the 2018 exam was I didn't do the writing tasks. I simply looked at them and had a look. And if you want to, you can think about what you might write. But what I really focused on was the multiple choice questions. There are 70 of them. I did a couple each day without any time constraints. What I would focus on was really scrutinizing the question, seeing what it was asking me, whether there was any quick ways of doing the question, and then checking that with the work solutions and with the answers. So yeah, that's what I did, a couple questions each day. And I think if you really think about them, the GAT is really like a sort of IQ test where there are quicker ways to do things. And once you get a hang of that, you'll be really well prepared for the actual exam. So let's start with the first writing section, which asks you to present the information as best you can. So really the task tells you exactly what it wants to do. There's no need to be too fancy. All it wants you to do is present the information as best you can. So the way to do this is it really wants you to integrate the information and synthesize it and present it in an organic way, because the way the information is given to you is quite disparate and very spread out. You have a picture here, quotes here, they're all really separate. What it wants you to do is to make them very smooth, a smooth transition into each other. So the way to lay out the writing, the way I took, was I just had a pretty simple intro, a quick intro, talking about the theme. For example, Mars. Maybe I'd say there are a lot of people talking about this issue, or people with different takes on this issue, and that's sort of my concluding sentence of my introduction. And then I go into my body paragraphs. So what my body paragraphs would do was speak to a theme about the issue, and within the quotes and pictures and tables that were given, I would try and group those together that speak to the same theme. So for example, for Mars, the first theme could be getting to Mars. There might be someone talking about how dangerous spaceships are. There might be a table showing the fatality rates of spaceships, and you can group those together all in one paragraph. So there might be here and here on the pages, but you can put them together in that one paragraph, and that's really what the examiners like. And my second BP might be about living on Mars and the things needed for that. So there are probably likely a lot of information on that. It might be a quote from an astronaut, a quote from someone who's studied in astrophysics, talking about what it will be like to live on Mars. And you can group that with maybe there's a table showing what foods humans need to survive, and you can group those together like that. So two main things, that ways you can group them. One is you group them within paragraphs, and two, I would try and have a general overall structure as well. So for example, for my Mars one, it sort of went from going to Mars, then to living on Mars, and then within each paragraph, there was a strong theme there as well. And I'll try and get in as much of the information as possible because that's what they're really looking for, and try and group them well. Of course, if one really stands out and doesn't fit in at all, then it doesn't matter too much. But yeah, try and group them in and try and include as much as you can. So let's move on to the second writing section. This one's a bit more iffy. It's harder to say what you need to do well because it's not as clear cut and it's not an informative piece such as the first writing task. What I would say though is that if you plan to have extra time, or if you want to allocate extra time to another section, or even on the day, if you just happen to have more time left over, I do recommend spending it on this section because it asks you to develop an original point of view. And I think that is really hard to do and to support within the constraints of 30 minutes. So just general advice for this section, I would say just really have a deep think, whether that's during reading time or during the actual writing part of the exam, about what your point of view is. Because once you come up with that, it becomes easier to support and even present a rebuttal against it. So the way I arranged it is I would speak about the quote. I wouldn't really incorporate it into my piece. I'll just have it in the intro. I'll talk about it a little bit, introduce the quote, and then in the later paragraphs, I would present differing views that people may have on it, and which ultimately come together to form my own contention. So maybe sort of 3 paragraphs for it and 1 paragraph against it. It's kind of like a persuasive essay as well. What I would say though is just keep in mind that the examiners are reading like thousands and thousands of these. So really try and make it original, and even if your view is one that is likely taken by other people, try and write about it in more interesting ways. That way it can really stand out to the examiner. And of course, the classic spelling, coherence is really important as well. A mistake I see a lot of people making is that they feel like they have to incorporate more of the statements, or even sometimes all of the statements. That's actually not the case. So I actually only used 1 statement because that's the only one that really stood out to me, and I thought talking about the other ones would detract from my overall contention. So don't feel forced to do that at all. If you feel like some of the statements work together well, then go for it. But if you only like 1, that's completely fine as well. Don't feel like you have to put more. And just overall with the 2 writing sections, don't feel like you have to use really good vocabulary or very difficult words. Sometimes that can come off as quite verbose and quite annoying. It's quite hard to understand and quite clunky as well. Just try and articulate your ideas well. Have complex ideas, but express them in a straightforward and clear manner, and the examiners will really appreciate that. That's sort of something that's important in VCE English as well, and here for the GAT it's no different. So clear, concise language, complex ideas, and you can definitely do well on this section. So finally, we are up to the multiple choice questions. Now this is the bulk of the exam. So what I would advise for the English questions, first off, bring a dictionary. I highly recommend bringing a dictionary. It really helps out, especially with the English questions. A lot of the times they ask you to define the mood or define a person, and there are a lot of adjectives given. Some of them are rare to see every day, so it's really useful to have a dictionary which can help you define the words. I remember no thesaurus as well, so try and get a dictionary that's solely a dictionary. With the English sections, comprehension, mood, all that kind of thing, really consider what's happening, especially if you're given a picture and they're asking you what type of person is this guy, or how is the interaction, what's the atmosphere like. Really consider visually what's happening, what the people are wearing, what visual aids are in the picture, and also what's being spoken, if there are speech bubbles. Remember, the examiners probably sat there with the picture and came up with the questions, so it must be something really obvious, must be the most obvious answer that really popped into their mind. I think if you consider the visual aids and what might be spoken, that will really help guide you to the most obvious and also the correct answer. So with mathematical questions and sort of logic, science, all that kind of thing, one thing to keep in mind is that you don't have calculators. So if you're finding that question is taking really long or the numbers are getting really messy, I think just consider the possibility that there is an easier way of doing the questions that you might have missed. And I think try and look for that, because they're not really there to test whether you can multiply 4-digit numbers. They're just really testing whether you can see the way to do the question rather than whether you can execute it or not. And so also when you first see a question, I do recommend taking a minute to pause, especially when you're practicing. Before the real exam, I recommend highly trying to find some work solutions. If your school has people who do have videos like Scotch of people doing the exam, that really helps you out. It seems like the quickest way to do the question. But even in the exam itself and when you do practice questions, look at the question. If your first instinct seems like a multi-step process, maybe consider that there is a quicker way and just take a few moments to think about it. If you do that during your practice, it will come much easier during the actual exam as well. One last thing, with simpler questions that seem quite easy, just take your time with them, make sure you don't make any mistakes. It's not like other exams where sometimes you may have time to come back to check. For me, it was just such a long exam that I really didn't have time to check the easy questions. I didn't have the liberty to do so. If I had more time, what I would have spent it on were the harder questions or the writing tasks. So when doing the easier questions, it's better to not lose marks. You can't really afford to lose marks here. So just take your time, make sure you do it right the first time around, and that will really go a long way if you make sure you do that with all the seemingly trivial questions. So that's it with the GAT related advice. I know it's a bit later in the year. You may want to revisit this video, and I might make some more detailed videos regarding the GAT later in the year as well. If you're looking for some more VCE related content, please check out my previous video. I hope you guys enjoyed today's release. Best luck with your studies and see you next time.